highlight the insights of female scholars who work in the field of Orthodox Christian studies. We have a suspicion that the center's broader audience is not sufficiently aware of the tremendous work that is being done and has been done for the past generation by women scholars. And so this series is designed to bring greater awareness to the work and personal lives of women whose books and articles are being read not just by college students and professors, but by seminarians, priests, and bishops across the world. Today, I'm delighted to introduce the very first scholar in this series, Dr. Susan Ashbrook Harvey. Dr. Harvey is the Willard Prescott and Annie McClelland Smith Professor of History and Religion at Brown University. She specializes in late antique and Byzantine Christianity, with Syriac studies as her particular focus. Dr. Harvey has published widely on topics relating to asceticism, hagiography, women and gender, hymnography, homiletics, and piety in late antique Christianity. She has lectured across the world and was for many years a member of the North American Orthodox Roman Catholic Theological Consultation. Dr. Harvey is a past president of the North American Patristic Society, which is the most significant scholarly organization in her field. She has also been a senior fellow at Dumbarton Oaks, which is the premier institution for the study of the Byzantine world. I should also note that she has been an important contributor to the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham since its foundation. She was a member of our advisory council at the time of the center's inception. She currently serves on the advisory board for the center's academic journal, the Journal of Orthodox Christian Studies. And she was the first woman to deliver the Orthodoxy in America lecture, which she did in 2008. If you are not familiar with it, the Orthodoxy in America lecture is our center's signature public event. So the way this will work is I'm going to ask Dr. Harvey a series of questions about her work and about her experience as a scholar. You are free to chat in or to type in questions into the Q&A, and we're going to save some time at the end, and I will try to get to as many of those as we can. It's not likely that we'll be able to get to all of them, but we will do our best. So with all of those introductory remarks out of the way, let me welcome you, Susan.
I'm so honored to be here, George. It's great to see you, and I'm very honored about this series.
Yeah, great, great. All right, let's begin by talking about the actual scholarly work, some of the writing and the research that you've produced throughout your career. You are a specialist in Syriac studies. Syria is more in the news of late than it has been, perhaps in the past, but not everyone really knows what Syriac studies is. Certainly not every smart college student is drawn to Syriac studies. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what drew you to this?
I wouldn't say I was drawn. I sort of stumbled in. I certainly had never heard of Syriac before getting to graduate school. And I went to graduate school in Byzantine studies. I came out of classics, and I was focused on late antiquity, and very quickly was smitten, is that the right word? Struck by the Simeon the Stylite and the extraordinarily dynamic ascetic tradition that Syriac saints represented. When I began to learn the language, it was like discovering a treasure chest. It was a whole world open to me that I had never known anything about. It continues to thrill and excite to the present day.
So you mentioned Simeon the Stylite. He has one of the most, frankly, exotic, extraordinary stories from early Christianity. Students love learning about him. Can you say, just for our broader audience, though, a few additional things about, what is it that Syriac Christianity has to offer us as we study Christianity in the past and so forth?
I would say two things. one is there are many wonderful and interesting and exciting things about Syriac. A very interesting thing is Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, and it began probably in the 1st century AD, CE, in the region of Edessa, what is now southeastern Turkey, the town of Urfa. And in that 2,000 years, roughly, that Syriac has been its own language, it has almost always been dominated culturally by more powerful languages and political powers around which its people have lived. For example, Greek, Arabic, Turkish, even German, English. Now as the diaspora community lives in other parts of the globe. Syriac has always been described as a minority language. But it is a brilliant language, and it has yielded a brilliant and scholarly tradition throughout its history. Although it's been influenced by these other languages, it's also given back. It holds its own, and it has given back poetry, hymnography, saints, science. It has influenced other cultures just as it has been influenced. So it's been a place of exchange in very powerful ways. And it's interesting because imagery about merchants and trade are very basic to early Syriac Christianity. And its language is a language in which a great deal of cultural trade exchange in many directions has taken place, but it has continued to bring its own genius.
Beautiful. I've heard you speak before that whereas, Greek Orthodoxy or Russian Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism, these religious traditions have often experienced a great deal of political and economic power. And so the experience of Christians in the Greek tradition or the Roman tradition or the Russian tradition are familiar with Christianity in the majority. Not always the case, but over the long course of their traditions, that's what they're familiar with. And yet Syriac, that was never really the case, right? Can you say some ways in which you think that shaped the experience of Christianity for Syriac peoples?
I'm going to split that into 2 questions.
Sure.
One is, I think in terms of Orthodox, if we have Orthodox viewers, for many Orthodox, there's an idea that Orthodoxy, at least for its first centuries, if not its first 1,500 years, was somehow identifiable with the Byzantine Empire, and that the Byzantine Empire was Greek. But as you know, and I know, the Byzantine Empire was a multicultural, multilingual, rich tapestry of many different kinds of peoples. And in the Byzantine Empire, particularly its early centuries, you had Syriacs, you had Copts, you had Armenians, Georgian, Ethiopians, all these wonderful languages and peoples were part of that empire. And so it was a place of great vitality and great vibrancy. And Syriac was one of the real creative, dynamic forces in the midst of that. Especially in the areas of hymnography, of ascetic tradition, cult of saints. There's a reason why Saint Ephrem the Syrian is a universal saint for Orthodox and Catholic Christians everywhere. So Syriac is right there at the foundational center for Orthodox traditions. Syriac is there. In other ways, of course, as you say, Syriac Christians have not in their history had an empire, an emperor, as the Byzantine emperor was an emperor, a czar, as the Russians had. And it's interesting sometimes the contrast in imagery that can arise. So we have very prevalent in the hymns and the devotions about the Virgin Mary, for example. In Syriac tradition, she's often referred to as the daughter of the poor. Mm. At the same time that the Byzantines are painting her as an empress enthroned in glory, she's the daughter of the poor. And Syriac hymns talk about Jesus being born into poverty, born in dirt, surrounded by by poverty. And Mary asks there's a hymn where Mary says to her newborn son, who gave you this love for the poor that you would come to me and my poor husband Joseph? So the Syriac Christians were not necessarily poor. They were, and still are, magnificent magnificent silver workers in silver and gold, beautiful artisans. But there is a strong tendency to not use images from political power in the same way that one sees often predominating in other forms of Christianity.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I want to speak a little bit about what's probably my favorite of your books, a book known as Scenting Salvation. Or that's the title, Scenting Salvation. It's this brilliant original work about, well, really the sense of smell in early Christian writing, right? And performance. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were looking to do when you started that project, and just say more about it for you know, our non-scholars who probably aren't familiar with this kind of work?
Well, at the time, people used to ask me if I was crazy doing this. Salvation is a book about the religious significance of smell, whether that's incense or holy oil, or the smell of illness, or the smells of poverty, the stench of sin. The odor of sanctity is an ambiguous phrase. What is the odor of sanctity? It began personally as an effort to solve a puzzle about Syriac asceticism, and that was, why did asceticism, which is a often practice that can be very harsh, self-discipline, even self-mortification, why in Syriac tradition, ancient Syriac tradition, did this practice of asceticism, which seemed to be about renouncing the body or denying the body or punishing the body, why did these same sources talk all the time and value and engage in practices with incense and holy oil, and practices that seem to value and even expand, heighten awareness of bodily sensation and bodily experience? Incense and holy oils are everywhere in ancient Christian literature. Once you start looking for them, it's, you know, just pull anything off the shelf, it's everywhere. Why? Why? So scholarship often talked about ancient Christianity as a form of religion that was negative about the body, or that didn't value the senses. But why then was everything drenched in incense and holy oil? Why? You know, it's very important. So, you know, clearly a deep value was being placed on what one experienced with one's senses and how. And a major agenda of mine was to take seriously the role of the body in religion, the role of the reality of being embodied. There's a wonderful verse from a hymn by Ephraim the Syrian, where he says, thanks be to God for the many beauties he gives to us, so many scents, so many tastes, so many colors, so many well, what are we doing if we're giving thanks for all those kinds of things?
Right.
So clearly the body matters. So it was really an effort to try to think about why the body matters and what it can be used for. And smell is just a very exciting way of doing that.
Well, and let me add, just an incredibly creative and original way. I remember sitting in on a book panel at the Byzantine Studies Association, and where speaker after speaker got up and said this was the most creative and original thing they'd ever seen, and really just magnificent. So, you know, I have lots of things I want to ask you about, but I do want to ask you also about one other aspect of your research, which is your work on hymns and liturgy and women's choirs. A mutual friend of ours, Derek Kruger, credited you with coining the phrase the liturgical turn, which is obviously a play on the concept of the linguistic turn. Can you tell us why you think the study of hymns, early Christian hymns, and their performance and the way that they were performed is so important for our understanding of early Christianity?
So first of all, I think Derek is the one who coined that term. But let me say that, so there have been kind of two big ways that early Christian hymns have been studied largely, both very important and very rich in their scholarly traditions. One would be to look at hymns the way you would look at poetry or, fine literature of any kind. Many of these hymns are exquisite compositions and they merit very beautiful analysis in that way. And the other way that hymns have been looked at is in terms of the history of music and musicological technical details. So all these are very important. But when you turn to the issue of hymns as and how they were performed from the vantage point of a social historian, which is where I would put myself, a whole different scene opens up and a whole vista that we often don't get to see comes into view. Who's singing these hymns? When? Where? How? All of a sudden, all these other people come into view. The structure of early Byzantine hymns, quite often, would be to have verses, short verses with a refrain. And so you might have a chanter or a choir sing the verses, and then you would have the congregation respond. So these hymns represent a form of exchange, a dialogue, in fact, in which everyone is participating. Well, who's doing the singing? Are they choirs? Are they male choirs, female choirs? Who's in the congregation? Women, men, children, slaves, the poor. All of a sudden, you have people who are actively participating, not passive observers, actively contributing to liturgy, who aren't present the way that we look often at the history of liturgy. One way, one of the exciting things about late antiquity, I think a great deal of religion took place outdoors. The processions of the liturgy, many of them were outdoors, through the streets of the villages or towns, in the public squares, in the marketplace. And, these orderly or disorderly processions, but loud and filled with singing. These were public events, public voicing. If women were singing, women's choirs are singing, if slaves are singing, if children are singing, this is a public act and it carried public significance. And it makes liturgy to us as historians bring forward a very different understanding of what early Christian worship involved and made possible, really. And if women were doing the singing, which in Syriac they were, not only in Syriac, this is a hugely important thing. Women's voices were very important in the history of the church. So one way that you can look at the history of liturgy, the way it's often done, is you take a camera like the ones on us, right?
Yeah.
And you shine it either on the pulpit where the bishop is preaching, or you shine it on the altar where the priest stands consecrating the Eucharist. Flip that camera around, look out, not in at the altar, but out. And there's a lot going on in liturgy, and a lot of people are involved, more than a bishop, more than a priest. So it helps us think about religious ritual in much larger, more inclusive terms on a much bigger scale, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, your work, Derek's work, and others. I mean, you're getting me into all of this as well, and it's fascinating. And the dramatization of the biblical stories, and
fantastic.
They're spectacular. And what I'm really enraptured by is who is singing the parts of various biblical figures, right? And when you sing in first person, as like when you take on the persona of the biblical characters, I mean, it's really just spectacular. But and I love this image you say of let's turn the camera around and not look necessarily at the bishop or the priest, but at who's there and what they're doing. I love that. And it's actually a great transition to a set of other questions that I'd like to ask you about. You're a scholar of religion. You wouldn't self-define as a scholar of theology.
No, I'm not a theologian.
Right, right. Can you say a little bit about how you understand the relationship between the two, and why you so boldly say, I do religion, I don't do theology?
Well, religion is a field of study, George. So theology, one way to look at it is that theology is one part of religion. And it's a big part. It's the part of religion that's about beliefs. And it starts from the question, or maybe it's easiest to understand if you start from the question of who or what is God. And then many other questions, you can answer all other questions because you've started from that position. That's theology. But so that's your starting point. God or divinity is your starting point. Religion is something much broader, and its starting point is people. And so we start from the question of who are the people? What are they doing? I always say to my students, what do they eat? What are they wearing? Who do they marry? How do they marry? How do they greet their newborns? How do they bury their dead?
Yeah.
Do they have pilgrimages? Do they have saints? Do they have shrines? Do they have icons? And if they don't, what do they have? I just had a student did a wonderful project taking photographs of devotional objects in the houses of her friends and just asking them what they meant to them. So theology is a part of religion. It's a piece. But religion has and then the one other thing I would say, so I teach in a secular university, you teach in a Roman Catholic university. Theology as a word normally denotes Christian belief or Christian thinking. And so departments of theology tend to be dominated by the teaching of Christianity in its different aspects. I teach in a department of religion where we teach multiple religions, and we teach religion as a human phenomenon. So in my courses, I teach about Christianity, but I also teach about Jews and Muslims. I teach about ancient religions, Greeks and Romans, Egyptians, not just Christianity. So it's a different vantage point, yeah, and often a different set of tools.
It's when I was going through graduate school, I found the theology versus religious studies to be a real battleground, right? You had to really pick a camp that if you did one, you couldn't do the other, and vice versa. I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, but I would say that at least in academia in the last 10 years, I think those battle lines are breaking down, and that and that people are seeing, like scholars of theology or scholars of religion are seeing how being in kind of active dialogue and participation with scholars on the other side is a much more fruitful way to pursue your own.
Absolutely. And even to come back to the issue of choirs or study of liturgy, there was a period when I was first working on choirs and it actually goes back earlier when I was working on sending salvation. I need to learn about liturgy. I mean, I needed to learn about why you used incense and all this. And Brown University has a magnificent research library, and I'm very lucky to have it, but we had almost nothing in our library on liturgy. I would have to go across town to the library. In those days, we had to go use actual libraries, Yeah. And I would go to Providence College, which is a Dominican Roman Catholic college. They had a fantastic library when it came to liturgy. And then it began to shift because our librarians began to order books in ritual studies. And in fact,
not liturgy, ritual.
Right, liturgists were also beginning to use ritual studies for their own scholarship. So now, in fact, Brown has a terrific collection on liturgy because they, came in through this other door. Yeah. But similarly, I think, we value interdisciplinarity a great deal, and in the academy. And certainly at a place like my university, I'm very lucky to be in that context where interdisciplinarity is just so cherished. And so theology then becomes part of an interdisciplinary way of thinking, a way of study, a way of scholarship. And I think you're right. I hope we're past the fierceness of those battles.
Yeah, good, thank you. Let's discuss, if you don't mind, your experience in some professional organizations such as Dumbarton Oaks, the North American Patristic Society. You've been one of a very small collection of women who has had prominent roles in these organizations in the past. How would you characterize the state of things in these organizations and in the field more generally for women scholars?
So a lot has changed over the many years of my career, but I think, and it's interesting where the presence of women has flourished and where it hasn't. The North American Patristic Society is a great success story. It's a great example. So I first attended the North American Patristic Society in 1983. There were about 70 people there, maybe 66, and there were 5 women. Mm. We called it a sea of men in black, because that's what it was. Now, today, the society numbers around 800 or so, and it's probably half or a little more than half women. And I mean, it's flourished. And one reason it's flourished, and one reason the percentage of women has increased so much, is because the North American Patristic Society, as you know, has expanded beyond theology. It includes history, art history, religious studies. So an interesting thing, if you look at, actually there's new statistics out. In the humanities, I just had this discussion with my dean. In the humanities, more than half of the advanced degrees in the United States are obtained by women. But if you look at women faculty members in theology departments, it's around 25%. And across the humanities, there's a spectrum. Fields like, gender studies, 89% or something like this. Philosophy is another one, like theology. But I think that for theology has tended to be dominant. It continues to be dominated by male scholars, not least because theology has been dominated by patriarchal church institutions. Whereas, other aspects of the other fields within the academy have opened up in different ways. So the changes are coming. There are more women undergraduates, and the number in graduate study is increasing. So we will see shifts in those. But North American Patristic Society has been a great place to see what began as a very uneven experience, shifting to a much more egalitarian population.
Great. If you don't mind, I want to talk a little bit about your experience of the Orthodox Church itself. I believe that you converted to Orthodox Christianity in part as a consequence of your graduate studies.
To call it a hazard of the profession.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? About how the academic work sort of brought you into the church and so forth?
So I was a classics major in college, and I spent my junior year in Greece, the whole year. And I went because I loved Homer and I loved the Greek tragedies so much. And I had never really heard of the Byzantine Empire. I don't think I had ever encountered Orthodox. I had no idea what it was. I had never seen an icon. So I'll just say that year changed everything, including what I studied.
There you go. That's great. What about, how would you describe the state of things for female scholarly voices in the church? I know that you've been put on panels, you've been invited to speak in front of bishops, right, and this sort of thing, and I know that you're active in your own church community. I mean, is there a place you think within are people in the church interested in hearing from women scholars?
In many contexts, yes. And I think this is a way in which things are changing a lot. More and more Orthodox women are gaining academic degrees in every possible field, whether it's the sciences. Gail Woloshock, president of the or former president of the Orthodox Theological Society. So whether the sciences, whether the humanities, whether the social sciences, women are gaining advanced degrees, and there is the secular academy and even the religiously affiliated academy can provide places where women can flourish as scholars and teachers. And one can do research that can be a great contribution to the church if people are interested in it. There are many ways that one can serve one's religious community that don't have to do with the issue of whether or not ordination is something one is interested in. I mean, there's a lot more to do than just that, a lot more to do than what just is at the altar. In other ways, of course, religion in general, in the last several decades, has become much more conservative in certainly in North America, many Orthodox countries as well. And conservative trends often are challenging for women. They can really affect how women are viewed, what kinds of roles, what kinds of possibilities are available for them. But something I've been taking great comfort in recently, I'm watching the changes at the level of the local parish. As many more women are active professionals, they bring their professional skills and training to the parish. So whether that's being the treasurer, whether that's serving on the parish council, being president of the parish council, maybe that means being a Sunday school teacher, director of the Sunday school, maybe it means being the choir director. There are many, they could be chaplains, they can be scholars, they can be teachers. As women's professional lives, as it were, contribute to the life of the local parish, one sees enormous changes happening at the level of the parish. Now, you can look at photographs of synods, they look just the same. So, from the top, the view looks like that. But at the local parish level, there's a lot happening, and the changes are real.
Yeah. I think you're. My sense is that you're right about that. I mean, we see this at Fordham in terms of the doctoral students. Some of the doctoral students we're attracting. Certainly the women who are submitting essays to the journal and to Public Orthodoxy and to that sort of thing. I mean, as you say, there's a really large number of young women in large part inspired by the work that you and others did before. No, it's true.
And we had the International Orthodox Theological Association. I had a meeting in Romania last year. It was tremendously thrilling. I mean, there were Orthodox scholars from all over the world. There were 300 something papers on the program, and in every sciences, social sciences, humanities, theology, yes, but not only. Right. And there were many women there, and it was very exciting.
Yeah. No, I agree. All right, if you don't mind, I want to go ahead and try and get in some of the questions we've gotten from the group, and then maybe I'll come back and ask you maybe a little bit more. All right, so we have one here from Teva, who writes, how can the Academy scholarship help to inform our ecclesial practice? In other words, the relationship between the Academy and the Church. For instance, how can scholars help to inform our liturgical practice, the ministry of women today, questions of anthropology, etc.?
Well, thank you for that wonderful question. That's questions. But I think, one of the gifts that I think scholarship can bring to not only to the church, to society, is knowledge. Knowledge can be a wonderful thing, and history can be, knowledge of history. Sometimes it can be tough. The history might be different than what you think, but in other ways, sometimes history is liberating, and it's often chastening. So it's probably important to remember that there have been times when women have had important leadership positions within the church's different kinds of leadership. The titles we use for different levels of offices in the church, the titles we use, deacons, subdeacons, priests, bishops, we have feminine forms of these in ancient Christian and inscriptions. It's clear the words weren't always used in the same way, but women clearly were preaching and teaching and baptizing, leading Christian communities. We need to remember that women were doing that in communities of faith. And so it's not some new idea that just suddenly popped into the head of some, late 20th century woman. It's an idea, not an idea, it's a history that's there. So in some ways that's an important model to remember. Another way I think that that scholarship can help is one of the things that's clear in scholarship, whether you look at the worship practices of the church liturgy or its music or its theology, is that there is constantly and is always tremendous change over time. Father John Meyendorff used to say, a church incapable of change is a church that's dead. A church that's living and alive and has real people in it changes. So we need to be able to think about what is meaningful in the present, how one draws on tradition, not as a straitjacket, but as something that might open and enable more fullness, more justice.
Thank you. So we have a question here about the Achathist hymn, right? So Kay writes, was the Achathist hymn a multicultural hymn, or was it just in Greek? Why was it not embraced by all? It's incredibly beautiful and deep, as we all agree. And this is where you can really help Syria Susan. Was there any influence from the Syriac tradition on the development of the Achathist?
So the Achathist hymn, of course, is one of the truly great achievements, just an extraordinary artistic achievement in Christian history, not just in Orthodoxy. So as a Greek hymn, it draws very deeply on many different aspects of the Greek language and its poetic tradition. It was Greek, and soon after the Achathist became common in liturgical practice, there was a division taking place between the churches in the eastern part of the empire. So I don't know, I know of a Latin translation of the Achathist. I don't know of a Syriac one. But many of the images in the Achathist hymn were images that were shared by hymn writers, Syriac as well as Greek. And soon, or not that long after, the Achathist hymn would be the flourishing of the career of Romanos the melodist. And he brought many images and many exegetical traditions from the hymns of Syriac authors, especially Ephraim and Jacob of Sarug, and he brought those into Greek. So there's a tremendous influence that way. The Achathist hymns flourish also in Russian. I mean, there's more than one. It's a tradition of writing. So I think that the way this person is thinking of the Achathist hymn is a form of it that is distinctive to the Greek. There are counterparts to that in Syriac also represent very fine theological as well as artistic poetry towards the Virgin Mary.
Okay, great. Valerie writes, thanks so much for the fascinating conversation. I wanted to ask how you might use iconography as well as hymnography in the flipping the liturgical focus to the congregation. I'm thinking here, for example, village churches. Sharon Gerstle discusses in an article about the male and female saints are all mixed together, or the female incense bearers in the fresco depicting a procession from a monastic church near Arta, Greece.
There's a very beautiful painting in the Syriac monastery in Egypt, medieval Syriac. I think it's 10th, 12th century painting of the Dormition. And the Virgin Mary is lying on her bier in red, and she's surrounded by her handmaids, all of whom have censers, and the apostles are kind of way in the background. So it's the same iconography that's traditional from the Byzantine churches of the Dormition, or the funeral for the Virgin Mary, but instead of having the apostles gathered around her bed, which is the way it's depicted most often when one thinks of it in Greek, here we have her surrounded by women, and they're all wearing red. It's very beautiful. So we often have surprising things in iconography. I find it interesting whenever I go into an Orthodox church, wherever I am, I like to see if I can visit and see what's on the walls. And are there women saints? And or is it only the Virgin Mary and then lots and lots of male saints? And there can be drastic differences. It doesn't matter whether you're in North America or in Greece or somewhere else. Some of the churches really have a lot of women saints, and some of them really don't, except for the Virgin Mary. And I would agree with Valerie. It's wonderful. There are many wonderful saints of the church, and women have a terrific presence among the saints of the church. So iconography is it's a treasure store to be both explored in terms of there being much more variety than we often think, and also to be expanded. There are many women iconographers now working in Orthodox contexts.
A different sort of question here, but one I think many people might benefit from. Scott Hendricks writes, if someone is familiar with biblical Hebrew and wants to study Syriac independently or through an institution, where would you recommend one begin?
Well, Hebrew is a great base for Syriac. Syriac's a dialect of Aramaic and is part of the Semitic language family. So that's a terrific base to begin with. And of course, then there's the question, do you want to learn classical Syriac? Do you want to learn modern, Neo-Aramaic as it's spoken now? But there are a number of wonderful places to study it. Beth Mardutho in New Jersey with George Kiraz has a wonderful online classical Syriac program that includes a lot of the living tradition now. Catholic University of America, there are quite a number. Princeton, of course, there are lots of places where Syriac is being taught here at Brown, but not only in the universities. There's a lot online now, and it's not hard to find resources online that are really helpful and really interesting.
Thank you. So we have many more questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. I think maybe we'll take two more because we're already up against the kind of time that we had planned. But we'll take a few more if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So Catherine writes, "Thank you, Dr. Harvey, for your contributions to ecumenism. Could you speak about how the Syriac tradition could enrich and advance the ecumenical dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church?"
Well, there are, of course, Syrian Catholics, just as there are Syrian Orthodox. And so the traditions of Syriac-speaking Christians are very deeply woven into both Catholic and Orthodox churches in their larger views. So you have Syriac tradition, whether you're looking at the church from the Catholic or the Orthodox side. And I believe that increasingly there has, for some decades now, there have been ecumenical conversations between the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic and the Oriental Orthodox churches. And then there's been a terrific ecumenical dialogue in Europe between the different Syriac churches speaking together. Back to the question about how scholarship can contribute to the life of the church, I think one thing scholarship allows us is the possibility of looking at what have been claimed to be theological differences between churches, and to adjudicate those differences in better terms now. That is, rather than having to condemn each other to eternal, burning in the fires of hell for all eternity, we can understand that people have used different kinds of language, different models, different imagery for understanding and thinking about religious truths of different kinds. And we can hopefully appreciate that there's something to be gained from knowing more possible ways of thinking about it. Nobody set out to be a heretic, People set out to try to be more faithful, right, more true, to understand better. And I think we can draw from history and draw from tradition in more fruitful ways in the context of ecumenism. I'm a great believer in ecumenism. I've been sorry to see that it's fallen to it's become a kind of side issue for many Christians. That's too bad. We have a lot to learn from each other.
Yeah, certainly. Stevie writes, Professor Harvey, what kind of work would you like to see scholars doing in your field? What kinds of questions do you think need to be asked?
Well, it depends on how you define my field, I guess. I have many, or I think of it as many. In Syriac, we are just beginning to really be able to bring the treasures of Syriac texts and Syriac archaeological history, material history into the scholarly domain. We have, in the time of my career, there's been, longer than that. The 20th century, over the course of the 20th century, we saw great emergence of critical editions and increasing now translations into English or other European languages. So the texts become usable by scholars who don't know Syriac. And increasingly, we're beginning to see scholarship or popular writings that kind of translate between these texts into, make the contributions of Syriac tradition accessible. We don't have nearly enough critical editions. There's so much of this work that needs to be done. I mean, the Greek and Latin tradition is so far ahead in this respect. So just more availability and more interest, more appreciation in what the Syriac has to offer is something I would really like to see. In Byzantine studies, of course, there's so much to be done, opening up how we think about Byzantium, who we count as among the Byzantines, how we understand what that tradition really could contain. In all of these cases, I would love to see a greater sense of, or a more inclusive vision, one that can be more flexible. I find increasingly with my undergraduates, they are less and less interested in specific Christianities, Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, and more interested in questions like, what does the body mean? How do we think about gender? How do we think about sexuality? And we as scholars need to make sure we're addressing those as well.
Good. Here's a potentially dangerous question for you. Can't let you get off too easy. So Father Ryan of the Society of Jesus writes, hi, a question regarding anti-Semitic language in hymns, particularly those on Good Friday. Does Professor Harvey have any thoughts on how the church should deal with these texts?
This is one of the real agonies, I think, confronting living practice right now. I think when you've grown up all your life hearing certain things, you actually hear them or you don't hear them. So I've had many Christians tell me, oh, we don't have anti-Semitic texts in our Holy Week services. And I say, well, do you read from the Gospel of Matthew? Curse Jews for all eternity. So people don't even hear them because they hear them, but they've filtered that out. So I actually, in my courses, we spend a lot of time looking at what is the language, what does it mean? One thing scholars have shown us is that oftentimes anti-Semitic language was used actually to talk about other kinds of Christians, power battles between Christians, but there's no questions that, you know, there were real Jews right outside the church door, and real Jews often have suffered deeply and horrifically because of the language that Christians have internalized. So it's been exciting to me to see some scholars like Bogdan Bucher talk about the need to change these hymns. This is, I think, an urgent issue. Rhetoric is, I talk about with my students all the time, rhetoric is rarely mere rhetoric. Real people lie on the other side. We have to think about, just because we've used a particular language for many centuries doesn't make that language good or right or fruitful. So I hope the church can address this and address it vigorously and soon.
Good, thank you. Father Lev writes, Saint Isaac of Syria is associated with the view that all will be saved in the end. Were there others in the Syriac tradition with this universalist outlook? In other words, is he an outlier, or is he speaking more for a broader Syriac tradition?
I guess I don't have a statistical answer on that one. There are, as you know, there's, of course, an array of views in the ancient church, whether Greek, Latin, or Syriac, or Coptic, Armenian, Ethiopic, and there were some, like Isaac or like Origen and others, for whom universal salvation was a very important part of understanding how God is merciful and compassionate. I don't have a statistical sense, but I will tell you a wonderful statement by Isaac. Isaac asked, why did the saints have, why were the saints beloved by wild beasts like lions, you know, the pet lions that sometimes that are pet antelopes. And Isaac said it was because the wild beasts could smell, the lions, they could smell from a holy person. They could smell the fragrance of Adam before the fall. What was the fragrance of Adam before the fall?
Yeah.
Anyway, it is true. It is a wonderful feature of Isaac's teaching, and he was not alone in that, neither among the Syriacs nor among others.
So another question, I was going to stop, but another question just came in that I really want you to answer. So this comes from Dr. Phoebe Armanios. Thank you so much, Professor Harvey, for this wonderful conversation. There's often a danger when discussing Orthodox communities today, especially those in the Middle East, of viewing them as lost or forgotten and even extinct. How do we foster a more robust scholarly interest, both in the ancient religious traditions and in living Orthodox traditions?
This is so important, and thank you. So these have all been wonderful questions, but thank you very much for this one. So these are living traditions, and I was always taught these as living traditions, and I teach them to my students that way. I'm not talking about something dead in any of these. None of us are. And it's such an important, one of the truly great gifts, really blessings I've received in my career is the generosity of Syriac Christians and their opening to me their churches, their books, their manuscripts, their the just outpouring of generosity as they've shared their traditions with me. They've been extraordinary. So these are living traditions. They are changing, and they are here. You know, as the catastrophes of the Middle East have continued, many Christians, the vast majority of Christians from the Middle East have left. Many are now in Europe or Scandinavia, many here in the United States or North America, many in Australia. And they're rooting and flourishing and building flourishing and exciting and vibrant and lively communities here. This is true of also the Copts. This is true of many. And so I was very excited last year at the American Academy of Religion annual meeting. They always had 12,000 religion scholars from all over the world. And there's a massive book exhibit, right? You know, it's like the size of, I don't know, football, how many football fields? Yeah. The number of new books particularly by anthropologists, ethnographers, scholars of religion, looking at contemporary, current Ethiopic Christianity, Coptic Christianity, Syriac Christianity, wonderful new books on the Syriac Christians of Sweden, for example. And I was so excited to see so much of it. It was like scholarship was discovering, you know, that these are living people, living churches, living languages, and they're exciting to study now, just as they're exciting to study for their past. And obviously, this is tremendously important for the study of religion, the study of Christianity, for our awareness of it now. There's a great deal to be learned, a great deal to be celebrated. And also, you know, we need to, if it's possible, we need to help.
Yeah, great. You know, I should note that question came from Dr. Armanios, who we haven't really made this public yet, but she's going to be the center's Coptic fellow, Coptic research fellow. For
and of course, you've had, you had some wonderful Coptic fellows already.
Yes,
Yeah, that's been a wonderful part of the center.
So I have one last question for you, which is, what are you working on now?
Oh, I owe your journal a review essay, actually.
Yes, you do.
On several new books that are just out on Ephraim the Syrian and Jacob of Sarug. Again, this part of this trend to encourage historical theologians to incorporate Syriac materials in their study. I am, you know, thick in a book I've been working on for many years on the Syriac women's choirs and the voices, women's voices in Syriac liturgy. So I really strongly want to finish that. This summer, however, my big job, I've been working on a little anthology of English translations of Syriac martyr texts from the Persian Empire, late antique, that I've done with several now former students. We have a little reading group for George's Press, and it's all done. I have to write an introduction for it.
Fabulous.
So, you know, a bunch of things.
Well, we will look forward to all of that. We can't thank you enough, Susan, not only for this time, but all you've done for the center over the years, for Orthodox Christianity, for scholarship. It's such a treat to know you. On a personal note, you're not going to remember this, but probably around the year 1998 or 99, I delivered my first conference paper at the Byzantine Studies Center.
The crossing of the Rubicon, right? It's the right.
You asked the very first question I ever received in a public forum, and it was the nicest softball question anyone could ever get, and I'll never forget it. It was very.
I thought you were going to tell me it was a horrible question.
No. So thank you for all that you've done for the rest of us. One last thing to note is that we're so excited about this new initiative, this webinar series featuring women scholars. We have just identified the date for the next one, which will be June 10th. We're going to try a different time slot. It will be at 12 o'clock. My colleague Aristotle Papanikolaou will interview Nadia Kazinko of the State University of New York at Albany. She's a historian there working on the Russian religious tradition. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Susan, and we will see you virtually sometime soon.
Thank you very much.